What it is, people, my name is Batman, and as you are all no doubt aware, the hype train for the next big piece of Destiny DLC is well underway. And before it gets too far ahead of us, I wanted to briefly take a look at the last two expansion packs and some of their shortcomings, and hopefully this will give you an idea of what to look out for when Bungie is pushing the Taken King, because what I want to emphasize in this commentary is that Bungie is very good at making it seem like they are selling a lot of content on paper, but when you really break that content down into hours played, it comes up woefully short of being worth their original asking prices. And I mean hours played while having fun, not hours played grinding to roll for some arbitrary piece of gear so that you can level up and grind out the exact same content you were grinding to begin with, just on a higher difficulty. So something I've seen a lot of people talking about lately is this idea that now that these first two DLC packs have been released, it's fixed a lot of what was wrong with Destiny. It's a much better game now. The expansions have compensated for a lot of the vanilla game's shortcomings. And there is absolutely some truth to that. Suddenly there's a lot more to do every Tuesday, and the list of activities is much more diverse than ever before. But I just want to point out that the biggest complaint everybody had originally was that the game seemed to be lacking in content. There wasn't a lot to do. And it's like, yeah, now that they've put in everything they cut out, it is a much better game. The part that sucks is that we had to pay an extra $40 for that to happen, right? That they ended up getting everyone to pay $100 for what I still firmly believe was originally planned to be $60 worth of content, in which I still believe, taken all together, those two DLC packs and the vanilla game, when that content is judged honestly, it really is only worth $60. I think the $60 deal they're giving people who have never bought the game coming up here in September, I think that's a very fair deal. But I do not think year one buyers, as we're now called, who bought it until the DLC, really got their money's worth. And that's what we're going to talk about in this commentary. And I do still think it's pretty clear that the entirety of the first two expansions were on the disc when the game launched. Not only because a clear majority of that content you see in those expansions was glitched into and put on video before they had been released, but I also think it says a lot that the story in these two expansions is still pretty incoherent. You'll recall that after the intense backlash to the awkwardly non-existent story in the vanilla game, Bungie came out and said, well, we're fixing that in the DLC. There's gonna be a story. You're gonna understand what's going on. But that was bullshit, because the story in these expansions was just as generic and incoherent and lacking in context or background as it had been in the vanilla game. There was the bare minimum of context for things they were having you do. I had this vague understanding that the Queen was cool with the Fallen, but then they had a beef, but I never understood why they were cool in the first place. And I never understood why my Guardian gave a shit about the Queen's beef with the Fallen. The whole Crota thing was generic, like, hey, here's this bad guy who's gonna kill everyone, so you gotta go kill him first. I had no idea who Eris was or why she was bleeding diarrhea out of her eyes. I didn't understand what the Prison of Elders was or what my purpose was in attacking it. And I'm sure these plot holes were filled in with Grimoire cards, but that's what they had to do with the vanilla game, right? And that's what people didn't like. And that's what Bungie said they were gonna fix, and it doesn't seem like they were really able to fix it. Which suggests to me that these DLC packs suffered from the same problems that the vanilla game story suffered from, which is that the content has been so chopped up and rearranged that it's not possible to form a coherent story in-game. And the only reason the DLC content would have that same problem is if, just like the vanilla game, it isn't being deployed in the original capacity it was designed for. More simply put, I think the lackluster narrative in these two expansions suggests they were cut out of the main game, and are thus lacking the context of the larger narrative they were originally a part of, and are now unable to provide more than the bare minimum of a generic plotline, right? Because if these DLC packs are original pieces of work built from the ground up with a DLC release in mind, then Bungie sucks ass at writing stories. And in either scenario, when they came out and said that the story was going to be a lot better in the expansions, that was false advertising. It wasn't. It was just as shitty. Now, before we go any further, I know some people are going to call me out on being an immoral hypocrite for having played some of the DLC when I told everyone not to buy it, and that's why you haven't seen a Destiny video from me in the last 4 months, is I was out of things to talk about because I wasn't accessing any of the new stuff, and I was sort of out of the loop. So before everyone flips a bitch and unsubs, let me just make a few points in my defense. And if you have to unsub after, I understand, alright? So first of all, I'm only playing the bare minimum amount of this content to accurately assess it in the name of YouTube journalism. I have not and will not play the raid. I watched a playthrough of it on YouTube to understand what it was all about. I played through the Trials of Osiris and the Prison of Elders one time each, and that's all I'll ever do. I have not, nor will I, play any of the multiplayer maps, except for the Cauldron, which was the map for the weekend I tried Osiris. Any gameplay clips you see on DLC maps are from my associate, Dr. Leatherwood, who many of you know contributes clips to all of my videos, but especially my Destiny videos. He's probably one of the best players in the game as far as multiplayer goes. And he bought the expansions primarily to continue playing multiplayer. And like I've said before, I admit Destiny has decent multiplayer. My beef has always been with the PvE. Or those DLC clips might also be from a number of subscribers who've sent me a lot of Destiny clips in the last couple of months. I have not, nor will I, use any of the DLC loot, or armors, or weapons, or any of that shit. I'll stick with my vanilla gear indefinitely so far. I've been able to upgrade it a little bit with exotic shards I got from dismantling my, vanilla exotics. I've played through the story missions and the strikes one time each, and I want to emphasize it was always by myself, and that's the extent of it. That is the extent of my DLC experience. If it's any consolation at this point, Destiny PvE is nothing but a chore to me. And I promise you I did not have that much fun, if any at all. And if there are any of you out there who joined me in protest against the DLC and did not buy it, you are not missing out on that much. And like I said in that original video, I bought the super deluxe whatever version of Destiny because way back in the day when I was still a Bungie fanboy, I was very excited for this game. And the shit's been auto-installing on my Xbox, and I'm not even sure how to uninstall it because it's all lumped in with the game itself on my apps page. So the DLC multiplayer maps started showing up in the rotation for multiplayer, so I just stopped playing the game altogether for the last few months out of principle. The only reason I feel comfortable accessing it now and showing some of its content in videos is because the period of time where our protesting the DLC made a difference is over, right? Both expansions have been out for a while now. Anyone who is or isn't going to buy those packs has made their decision. And anyone who hasn't bought those packs by now probably realizes they should just wait for the much better deal that will be available in September. It's kind of like that movie Super Size Me, right? The guy wants to point out the low quality of McDonald's food, but in order to do that, he has to buy a bunch of it and eat a bunch of it on video, right? So I'd argue this is kind of the same situation. Not that it's as big of a deal as, McDonald's and people's health, but you get the idea. I just wanted to get a feel for what the expansions had to offer, and although I am fairly critical of these expansions, I will say this. If everything in these expansions had been in the game from the beginning, as I suspect was the original intention, I wouldn't have had nearly as many complaints about this game. It would be a pretty cool game, except for maybe the shitty story. But again, had this stuff not been cut out, the story would probably still be intact. As a part of the vanilla game, all of this content would have been awesome. But as DLC packs that you have to pay $20 a pop for, I think they are pretty lackluster for their price. Because if you already own the vanilla game, there isn't really a lot of legitimately, unambiguously new stuff in these expansion packs. Playing through the story missions in both expansions, I repeatedly found myself spending significant amounts of time during each mission fighting in the open world spaces that were a part of the vanilla game, and fighting vanilla enemies, or fighting through areas that I'd already played through in vanilla story missions. Right from the start, the very first mission in the Dark Below has me playing through most of the same vanilla areas that I played through on the third story mission of the vanilla game on Earth, right? I was playing through the same areas where I think you see the Hive for the first time in the third story mission of the game, and all the thralls come charging at you in that one room. And I'm going through these exact same rooms that I've gone through in story missions before, and I'm just thinking, how, did I pay for this? Because I'm in a vanilla area playing vanilla enemies. Is this DLC? Does that count as DLC? I don't know. It's kind of ambiguous. Most of, if not all of, the DLC story missions and strikes had significant portions of their respective playthroughs taking place in vanilla areas against vanilla enemies. And we know that the Dark Below, that PlayStation exclusive strike, that took place entirely on vanilla terrain in the Black Garden area. And when they advertise these expansion packs, they say, well, this thing you're buying has 5 new story missions and 1 or 2 new strikes, or yada yada. But that's sort of misleading and disingenuous if, anywhere from 20 to 70% of each of those story missions, each of those strikes, those pieces of content, is vanilla enemies on vanilla terrain. It's sort of a gray area. Does it really count as a DLC? Because it's not new stuff. It's a very effective way for them to save money and thus turn a profit, because they don't got to spend time or resources developing that much new content. They just spawn a different combination of the same types of enemies in the same place. But the downside is that the customer is getting very little bang for their buck. There's all this controversy recently about people having to rebuy the game and DLC in order to get those special collector's edition perks, right? But why is this so surprising to people? Anyone who's bought the DLC thus far has already had to repurchase significant amounts of vanilla content. Significant amounts. You know, it's like when you go to the grocery store and you see a big ass bag of chips and you buy it, but then when you open it, like half the bag is just filled with air. Or like when you're at the drive-thru and you order a drink, but they fill it to the fucking brim with ice, so only like 25% of it is actual soda. And it's not just the story missions and the strikes. You know, in the House of Wolves, the biggest pieces of content, right? The main selling points were the Reef, the Trials of Osiris, and the Prison of Elders, right? I want to kind of undress each of these things to show you how hollow they are. Now, to their credit, Trials of Osiris was pretty fun. You know, I thought it was a really good way to use the loot system to enhance the experience of the gameplay because it added like this extra layer of fear and excitement to the multiplayer experience. It made the matches much more competitive. It made winning sweeter and losing much more painful. And that was the one thing I'm sad that I'm not going to be doing several times over. The rest of it, I could totally take it or leave it. But as a matter of principle, I will not play Osiris ever again, I promise. But I do still wonder, why is it something that had to be paid for? And you know, I made this argument about the Trials of Osiris before it came out, when we had a vague understanding of what it was. But it's not actually anything new, right? I mean, it's usually played on new maps, but the game mode itself and its mechanics is all vanilla. The vanilla game had 3v3 skirmish deathmatch and 3v3 relic with revives. They just rearranged the loot to better complement the gameplay, which is cool, but it'd be like if they charged money to play the Iron Banner, right? And it begs the question, why didn't they? Why are we paying for the Trials of Osiris and not the Iron Banner? As far as new content goes, does Osiris offer much more than the Iron Banner? No. In fact, you could argue the Iron Banner offers more. And we know the Trials of Osiris was originally planned to be an event. And we know there were mentions of the Trials of Osiris and Osiris as an actual faction in trailers before the game was even released. So I don't know exactly what's going on here, but I can't help but think that maybe at one point Trials of Osiris was supposed to just be a free event like the Iron Banner, right? Because in terms of the actual content, it's the exact same quantity of new content as the Iron Banner. But the Iron Banner is free. And it seems like maybe, I don't know, they decided, hey, we could make money off this, why the fuck not? All I'm saying is, if it smells like bullshit and it looks like bullshit and there's a bowl nearby with a shit-stained butthole, what conclusion are you supposed to draw? You know, imagine if Halo wanted to charge money to put SWAT or Team Snipers in the game. You know, multiplayer playlist rotations very rarely cost money. I mean, to be fair, we see other games include new PvP modes in their DLC packs, but never as a primary selling point. You know, because House of Wolves doesn't have a raid, but it does have Trials of Osiris and Prison of Elders. COD has a map pack with the standard 4 maps and a zombie map that we usually see, and then sometimes they also include, Reinforce or Momentum. Battlefield 4 drops its same typical map pack. You got 4 maps, you got a bunch of new guns and gadgets, a new vehicle or two, and then sometimes they also throw in, air superiority or capture the flag. We see PvP modes as extras, but we've never seen a game advertise a multiplayer playlist rotation as the primary selling point of a piece of DLC. It'd be kind of like if Battlefield tried to sell just 2 maps and air superiority for the same price as its usual packs, right? Instead of 4 maps. So I don't think that'd go over very well. I think Bungie is just the master of finding subtle corners to cut, of disguising vanilla content as something new when it's not, of strategically putting up paywalls in areas where the consumer base will accept them. And every now and then, they go over the edge, right? Like that's what happened with this collector's edition controversy recently, is that they were putting up this little paywall. They found an extra clever way to milk this minority of players who are so invested into the game that they want those emotes and the physical stuff, right? They find this extra paywall to milk them. That time they kind of went over the line. In fact, they didn't go over the line. The only reason that controversy blew up was because of the Luke Smith interview. But they find these sort of disingenuous paywalls that they put up in very strategically positioned places, where it's frowned upon, but it doesn't cause backlash, right? Now, Prison of Elders took place on new terrain, so credit to Bungie for that. It is a new area, technically 4 new areas for each difficulty setting, but it had the same vanilla enemies. It recycled the bosses, which if I were a real Destiny player, that would really be starting to get on my fucking nerves, right? I mean, I'm not that emotionally invested in this game anymore, but if I was, it's a scaled version of Atheon. It's a scaled version of Sepix Prime, scaled version of the Hive Ogre. And the gameplay wasn't bad. I didn't feel it was particularly memorable in the Prison of Elders, or that it had much replay value. It's not boring the first time around, but that's only because it's new and you're trying it for the first time. I don't see how it could be that fun a second time around. The only reason to replay it is to roll for better gear so that you could replay it a third time. But once you realize how redundant and ultimately pointless that incentive structure is, and assess it solely on the quality of its gameplay experience, you'll start calling it by its real name, which is the prison of meh. But of course I can't forget the Reef, can I? What a huge piece of content, an entirely new social space. Wow, very much spend. But it's not a social space, because again, you can't socialize with other players in this game, it's not possible. It's just a space, and not a very interesting one at that. The Reef functions exactly like the tower in every single way. It is almost entirely redundant, in the sense that there's nothing you can do there that you couldn't do in the tower, with the caveat being that it has 3 characters in it that the tower does not have, right? And of course the tower has a bunch of character vendors that the Reef is lacking. So imagine if they had just taken the Osiris guy, the Fallen Vendor, and the Queen and put them in the tower. There's plenty of space, I'm sure they could find somewhere to fit them, right? It would be the exact same amount of content, right? In terms of the experience provided, it would be the exact same tangible thing. They don't even have to use the Reef. But then they wouldn't be able to prop up the Reef as a selling point and tell you you're getting this new huge piece of content, a new tower, when really it's not new content. It's just like a new piece of artwork with mostly redundant, unnecessary content. All it is 3 new vendors. And if they had advertised it as 3 new vendors, that doesn't sound like nearly as much as a new social space, right? They advertised it as 3 new vendors that wouldn't have sold as many people. Not as many people would have been as excited, right? What this comes down to is boiling down their selling points to the essence of what they actually are. The Reef is nothing but 3 new vendors. That's all it is. And the only real tangible result of the Reef, other than being pretty to look at, is that it makes the main menu more frustrating to navigate, right? I've talked about this before, because the idea is that the tower and the Reef are supposed to be super immersive next-gen main menus. Well, now to access the options for Trials of Osiris and Prison of Elders, you gotta go through like an extra 5 minutes of hassle to go to a whole new area just to talk to those fucking dudes when they could have just been put in the tower to begin with. So I don't think the Reef counts as new content, unless you call it what it really is, which is 3 new vendors. I mean, it looks pretty, but outside of that, it's pointless and doesn't actually have a new experience to offer. And the tragedy of these DLC packs not having much in the way of a story or a meaningful narrative progression is that a story would significantly enhance and make up for the shortcomings of the DLC. You know, I wouldn't mind replaying through vanilla areas against vanilla enemies if I had some context for why I was doing that. You know, if I had some level of immersion, if I was interested in seeing the plot evolve. If I was curious about who the bad guys were and what they were doing here, and I was excited to have my questions answered and unravel mysteries, it would enhance the experience greatly. Even when I was playing through mostly vanilla areas, instead of saying, I've already done this, I'd be saying, what happens next? I'd be comfortable paying for the DLC for the same reason I feel comfortable paying, you know, $3.99 for a new episode of my favorite show on Apple TV. You know, the gameplay would just make the TV show interactive and that much more immersive. But without that story, you're left to judge it solely on its gameplay experience. And its gameplay experience is redundant, and most of it is available in the vanilla build, in the vanilla game in one form or another. Most of what you experience in that DLC, you didn't need to buy the DLC to experience, you know? And admittedly, you know, I understand the raid itself got decent reviews. Still think it's bullshit that ultimately the final boss is just a enlarged, you know, Hive Knight. But outside of that raid, it's just a lot of fluff, right? And the raid was only in one of those expansion packs, right? And so the question is, of the $40 you spent, or maybe it was $30 for some of you if you got the special, if you bought the DLC before the game was even out, like me. I'm not trying to be insulting. You know, what is the content to dollar ratio there? And that's something everyone needs to assess for themselves. But I think it's pretty low. And based on everything we've seen, I think it's safe to say that the original intent for the Reef was to act as a tower after you'd beaten the game and figured out that the Traveler was evil. Because we know the Reef was built at least a year before the game released, because it was in trailers from a year ago, from 2 years ago now. If it had had that sort of immersive narrative behind it, I wouldn't mind as much how pointless and redundant it is. But as it is, all we can do is assess it based on what it offers in terms of actual tangible gameplay experience, and its sole contribution is that it makes the main menu take a little longer to navigate. And so ultimately, when they were advertising the House of Wolves, you know, they talked a big game, a new wave defense mode, a new PvP mode, a new social area. Sounds like 3 big-ass pieces of content, right? But was it really? At the end of the day, how much of it was actually new? How many hours of replay value did it actually provide? And those story missions, even if the story missions had taken place entirely on, you know, new areas, even against new enemies, without a story, what replay value is there in the story missions? I mean, nowadays, nobody is even playing through that daily heroic. So those story missions are just sort of one and done type deals, and in fact, I bet you a lot of people are just skipping them altogether. I mean, they're entirely pointless, you know, what I'm saying is, even if those story missions were just nothing but new content, they still wouldn't have that much replay value. So at the end of the day, you know, how much of it was actually new? How many hours of replay value did it actually provide? And of those replay hours, how many of those hours were spent actually having fun? All right? We need to stop counting as replay hours, you know, time spent grinding for a piece of loot so you can replay the thing you're already grinding with a better helmet or some shit. If you're ever doing an activity in Destiny and it's not fun, and we've all been there, and you're doing it just because you want to roll for a piece of gear, that doesn't count. That doesn't count as, you know, hours played. And these are the questions that more Destiny players need to ask, especially when trying to decide whether or not they want to drop $40 fucking on the Taken King during the fall. And when that most likely means they're choosing the Taken King over one of the many brand new games that will be dropping, right? You know, if you're like me, you have to choose your games in the fall. There's going to be like a dozen games. There's going to be like 3 or 4 huge first-person shooter games, a couple, you know, less popular but niche games. And then you got your new sports games, you know, you got your big ass, there's going to be a big Madden release, a big FIFA release. For me, you know, I want all these games, but usually I have to choose a select few, right? And if I'm spending $40 on a piece of DLC, that's a game I'm missing out on. And so people really need to think hard if this is something they want to buy in the fall. Especially also because I guarantee you there will be a better deal down the road. I'm going to talk about that in future videos. But hey, I fucking called it on the Comet thing, didn't I, right? Back when we were still calling the Comet, we didn't know it was the Taken King. I was like, hey, don't buy the DLC. I guarantee you they're gonna lump it all together when they sell the Comet, and you're gonna get a much better deal. And I was right about that. You gotta give me credit for that. All right, and I'm telling you, you should wait on this too, especially because you want to get a feeling for it. You know, you want to see what people actually think of it. And it's completely fair and rational to recognize a consistent pattern of behavior and expect that pattern to continue with this next big DLC pack. Bungie has clearly demonstrated a tendency for big talk and low substance. Their marketing campaigns are top fucking notch, but their in-game campaign is shit. And there's this huge separation between how we feel before the thing comes out, whatever it is, and how we feel after it. You know, the hype is so out of touch with reality at the end of the day. In the last few years, game publishers have gotten very good at taking advantage of gamers' very short memories to the detriment of us all. And it's not just broken game launches, it's shit like this. The reception to the last 2 DLC packs hasn't been that positive. I mean, the Dark Below, people were pretty critical of that. House of Wolves, I know everyone argues it's better than the Dark Below, and it is in some ways, but I think the reception has ultimately been lukewarm. And I think just because, you know, Bungie outdid the standards that were already set so low based on their previous work, you know, that by itself isn't an accomplishment. And so when it comes to the Taken King, keep in mind that Destiny's past can be summed up in one word: underwhelming. Don't forget about the low quality of the last 2 DLCs when trying to figure out if you want to buy the next super DLC. And we'll be covering this topic a lot more in the next 2 videos. Please be sure to rate the video if you enjoyed it. This is Batman, signing out. Boom, shakalaka.